Russia's Prime Minister is on a three-day visit to China, a week before U.S. President Donald Trump's first trip to Beijing. I'll be looking at the future of Sino-Russian ties. And after Russian President Vladimir Putin meets Iran's top leaders, what are the possible ramifications for the rest of the region? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev is in the middle of a three-day visit to China. He co-chaired with his Chinese counterpart Li Keqiang the 22nd regular meeting between the Chinese and Russian premiers. The two sides signed a joint statement saying their comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination is moving forward at a rapid and steady pace, and relations have never been better. The two countries are increasingly expanding areas of cooperation and further aligning their development strategies. Now, Medvedev is the first foreign leader to visit China following the 19th National Congress of the CPC, during which a new CPC leadership was formed. His visit is also only a week before U.S. President Donald Trump's first trip as president to China. So what's the future for Sino-Russian ties in the new era, and how should major countries like China, the U.S. and Russia find common ground in their development? Joining me from Shanghai is Professor Yang Cheng from the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Shanghai International Studies University, and from Moscow, Pavel Falkenhauer, a Russian military analyst. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Professor Yang, now the mechanisms of regular meetings between the premiers of the two countries was established in 1996. Since then, it has served as an important platform to coordinate practical cooperation and people-to-people exchanges between the two sides. What has this mechanism achieved so far?
I think from the historical perspective, actually, Sino-Russian relations in the post-Cold War period had four stages. The first is normalization of the Soviet-Chinese relations, and the next is constructive partnership. Then in 1996, just as you mentioned, that strategic partnership has been established. And one of the key characteristics of this kind of bilateral relationship lies in its institutionalization of this bilateral relationship. So regular meeting between the two premiers is one of the key mechanism which was established since 1996. And this is quite important because the top leaders, like the presidents of two countries, will have reached a lot of consensus regarding the regional and international affairs. But for the Prime Minister, the main task for them is to realize all of the consensus which has been reached among the top leaders. So I think that the 22nd times they have met, I think that this is one of the index to show that how high is the level of these two bilateral relations between China and Russia in the past more than 2 decades.
Mm-hmm. Now, Pavel, what is the Russian perspective? How is Russia perceiving the significance of Medvedev's visit to China this time?
Well, in the Russian system of government, the Prime Minister is not really a political figure. He's more of a kind of day-to-day caretaker and running the economy, deciding kind of day-to-day issues and not strategic issues, and not very much involved in foreign policy and defense. Of course, he is, but he's on kind of, it's a day-to-day thing. So this visit will be primarily about the nitty-gritty of the Russia-Chinese relationship, of the partnership, on how to promote different kind of programs and projects of this multi-vector relationship between Moscow and Beijing. So this would be mostly practical things and practical discussions. Not kind of the political course has been already set by the presidents, and so this is a kind of filling that up and promoting making things happen, actually.
Which is also very important here. Professor Yang, I understand that this
Absolutely.
meeting... Yeah, I understand that actually the focus, let's say, of this meeting between Medvedev and Chinese Premier Li Keqiang is on economics, on the financial and trade relations between the two countries. Especially one of the key words is the Belt and Road Initiative and Russia's development strategy in Eurasian area, which is called the Eurasia Economic Union Initiative. So what kind of challenges and opportunities are the two countries looking at in aligning their development strategies?
Actually, 2 years ago, about in May the 8th, Chinese President and Russian President has signed a common declaration about the docking of the two programs. One is China's Silk Road Economic Belt, and from Russian side is the Russian-led economic, just as you mentioned, the Eurasia Economic Union. And since that, six rounds of negotiation has been launched between the different how to say, ministries. From Chinese side is the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. From Russian side, not Russian side, is Eurasian Economic Commission. And finally, on 1st October this year, they have signed also a common, reached a common idea to almost finish all of this round of negotiation. And the new agreement on cooperation between China's Silk Road Economic Belt and Russian-led Eurasia Economic Union maybe will be signed in the next year. So I think during the trip of Dmitry Medvedev this time to Beijing, one of the key issues is to discuss with his counterpart from Chinese side, Premier Li Keqiang, how to realize all of these agreements which have been reached, and also to discuss the future how many other key projects and also how many mechanisms should be signed between two sides. And as I know, besides the agreement on trade and investment, trade and economic agreement between China and Eurasian Economic Union, China and Russia will also start a new round of negotiation on the bilateral basis on how to deepen our economic cooperation. So I think this is quite, from this perspective, I think this trip is quite important.
Yeah, well, a quick follow-up question, because you specialize kind of on the economic relationship between China and Russia. What are the challenges the two countries are faced with at this particular stage, and where they need to focus their efforts on in the immediate future?
I think the biggest challenge maybe from both sides is that actually Russian economy still is in the crisis. It's not only because of the Western sanctions, but because of the structure which is rooted from the Soviet period until today, actually maybe even from the Tsar-Russia period. So it's quite difficult for Russia to change its structure. And as we know, for example, in many years, the Russian side has insisted to include the chapter or some sentence about how to optimize the China-Russia trade volume, trade and economic cooperation structure. But actually it's quite difficult because this is on basis of the comparative advantage from both sides. Russia has almost the same structure of trade and investment with more developed countries like European Union. But Russia has never raised this same question to the European Union countries. So I think actually we should, to some extent, reduce some expectation from both sides, because actually today I think there are a lot of limitations to raise in a very short period to raise quickly of this kind of trade volume and also investor volume. Even in the context that this year, from January to September, China and Russia total volume has reached more than 60 billion US dollars, but actually the structure is almost the same. I think it's quite difficult in the very near future to change this kind of structure.
Well, but then that also means opportunities. There is always the room to grow. Pavel, let me come to you now. In 2014, the two countries signed a 30-year gas supply agreement starting from 2018, and Russia has actually become the biggest supplier of oil to 1.5 years, which greatly diverged China's energy reliance on the Middle East. So how will this help China in solving a potential energy crisis?
Well, this has been, of course, very traditional since the 90s. Russia was selling China different kind of natural resources, gas and oil, coming, of course, in particular. For Russia, of course, it was very important that the Chinese would be paying some kind of price that would be more closer to what the Europeans are paying for Russian natural gas and oil, and in particular. But of course, these pricing problems apparently have been more or less overcome. But what's really changing right now is there's changes in pattern. If it was before natural resources, also, of course, Russian military know-how and hardware, and in exchange, Russia was buying Chinese consumer goods. Now there's increasing Chinese investment into different projects into Russia, and also Russia, that's under very serious high-tech sanctions from the West since 2014, is now increasingly looking to China to buy also Chinese technologies, Chinese double-use components and materials that we before bought in the West for space and also for actually military development. So this relationship is getting much more important, it's widening as Russia and China find themselves increasingly as kind of standing back to back in Eurasia.
Yeah, well, next week, U.S. President Donald Trump will pay his first state visit to China as well. Pavel, how do you see the timing of the two leaders' visits? Some people are saying that the close ties between China and Russia are in part due to the deteriorating relationship between Russia and the United States. What is your take?
Well, our relations with China may be the best since, I don't know, the 50s at least. But our relations with the United States right now are the worst since the height of the Cold War. And Moscow will be looking rather anxiously to what's going to happen during the Trump visit. Will China continue to be kind of a very serious sudden rapprochement between Beijing and Washington would not most likely make Moscow happy. So Russia would be looking to see what happens there, what will be the Chinese position in this Russian-American standoff.
Many thanks, Pavel. We'll be right back, so stay where you are. And here is my first point on this subject. Actually, zooming out, it is interesting to see that when U.S.-Russia relations are running low, China's relationship with Russia has been described as never better, and there are further potentials to be unlocked as the two countries continue on this positive momentum. It shows what mutual respect and a win-win attitude can achieve instead of mutual suspicion and the zero-sum mentality. There is also great potential to be unleashed in U.S.-China economic relations, for instance, under the Belt and Road Initiative, if America would see the light. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll be back right after this short break. Stay with us. Russian President Vladimir Putin has been visiting Tehran since Wednesday, where he was due to meet Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. According to the Kremlin, they were due to discuss the Syrian war and energy cooperation. Earlier this month, U.S. President Donald Trump announced a new strategy targeting Tehran, accusing it of cheating on the Iran nuclear agreement and exerting pressure on Iran's most powerful security security and military organization, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, or IRGC. Now, the U.S. is also pressuring Russia since the U.S. State Department has authorized a list of Russian defense and intelligence entities to be included in a new sanctions list. So why is Putin visiting Tehran at this particular time, and how will closer ties between Russia and Iran influence the Middle East? Besides Professor Yang Cheng from Shanghai International Studies University and Pavel Felgenhauer from Moscow, we are also joined by Mayor Javdenfar, a Middle East analyst from Tel Aviv. Welcome, Mayor. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Mr. Felgenhauer, let me come back to you first. Please elaborate a little bit on Putin's agenda in Iran. We know it's about the war in Syria and energy cooperation. What more details could you give us?
Russia, Moscow is trying to perform a very delicate and balancing act in the Middle East between sworn enemies, which turned out to be all of them, to some extent, Russian friends. Last month, the King of Saudi Arabia, the archenemy of Iran, visited Moscow for a state visit, and here in Moscow he denounced Iran. And also last month, the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, led a big Russian military delegation for very fruitful talks in Israel. And at the same time, when Israel actually attacked Israeli Air Force and totally destroyed Syrian government anti-aircraft missile battery south of Damascus. So first of all, Putin meeting the President Rouhani and the Supreme Leader Rahbar Ali Khamenei would be actually maybe trying to dissuade Iranian anxiousness that Russia may be turning away from Iran, and explain that Russia is friends with everyone, that Russia is in a unique position to speak to sworn enemies in the Middle East. And that makes Russia very important, but that Russia is not abandoning Iran. Of course, we have very important right now on battlefield cooperation in Syria between the Russian pro-Iranian forces and the Russian forces. So this Putin will be kind of balancing his Russian moves towards Israel and Saudi Arabia, at the same time showing Iran that we're with Iran too.
I get your point, and somebody would be watching, I guess, U.S. President Donald Trump. He announced Washington's new strategy against Tehran and the IRGC, blacklisting the latter as an organization that supports terrorism. Under this kind of pressure, what is Iran seeking from forging closer ties with Russia, in your eyes?
Well, I think Iran has always that the international system became unipolar, has become unipolar, and that the Americans have too much power and are trying to exert too much pressure on Iran. So Iran is happy to see Russia back in the fold, playing the role of a counterbalance against the United States. And also what Iran is hoping is that with Russia it will be able to find post-war influence and bases in Syria. I think some of the issues that will be discussed between President Putin and Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei will be the future of Syria. I think that will be the focus of the meeting between them. Although they say energy, well, to be honest, I mean, Russia's total trade last year, bilateral trade, import and export, was something like $460 billion, and trade with Iran was $2 billion. That's not even 0.5%. So I think the focus will be on Syria, and I think both sides, Russia and Iran, will be trying to find a position for the upcoming talks in Sochi on the 18th of November in Syria. I think the issues that will be discussed is the future of Assad, the future of pro-Iranian militia in Syria, the future of Iranian bases. There are some reports that Iran is interested in having bases in Syria, permanent bases in Syria, and also how far pro-Iranian forces should be kept away from Israel's border, as well as other issues relating to Syria. I think that will be the main topic of conversation, and this is where Iran will be looking at Putin, hoping to find a compromise with President Putin in a post-war Syria that will allow Iran to maintain its economic and military influence.
Professor Yang, now last Thursday the U.S. State Department authorized a list of Russian defense and intelligence entities to be included in a new sanctions list. Now both Iran and Russia are facing pressure from the U.S. at this moment. So under these circumstances, what can Russia offer to Iran by driving closer to Iran in this particular moment?
So I think actually in recent, not only this current moment, but in recent 2 years, a lot of agreements have been reached among between Russia and Iran. I think not only they have some consensus and some common interests in Syria, related to Syria interests, and for Russia, I think, especially for Iran, Russian support, Russia standing for Iran, especially in the context of the U.S. Trump's administration new attitude toward the nuclear issue, Iranian nuclear issue. So I think maybe from the Russian side, it will be raise some new projects, new proposals for cooperation. For example, so this time, as the spokesman of Vladimir Putin has mentioned, that one of the main topic is about the energy issues, energy cooperation between them. And also for Russia, maybe I think it's quite crucial to have Iran on its side in the Syria issue. Especially there are very close cooperation between Russia's military force in Syria and also the pro-Iran forces in Syria. And also in the context of this, just have finished the 7th round of Astana process. And almost failed, and in this context, I think they are both for both sides, because in comparison with, for example, the very important also another player in the Syria issue is Turkey. I mean, between Russia and Iran, there are more common interests. So I think they can not only just Russia offer something for Iran, but also Iran also can help Russia to deal with the so crucial question, so crucial problem in Syria.
Pavel, what is your thoughts? What is your reaction to what Mr. Yang just said, especially when he mentioned the Astana process? He mentioned that the process seemed not to have been very fruitful. However, Russia is said to have been dominating in the talks, and the Russian Foreign Ministry announced on Tuesday that some 33 Syrian opposition groups and political parties had been invited to Sochi for a Syrian Congress, a national dialogue later this month. It looks like a lot of momentum has been generated. What is your thoughts on this?
Well, yes, it's important, and it's possible to kind of corral all the Syrian differing fighting fractions to Sochi, but making them actually reach an agreement and making that agreement to stick is a totally different matter. There's common goals in Syria for Iran and Russia, but there are also constant differences, and if not clashes, at least there's some kind of friction there on the ground between the Russians and the Iranians and pro-Iranian forces, and Iran is explaining that without their ground forces, Russia will not get anywhere, and Russia, of course, was explaining that without the Russian Air Force, the pro-Iranian forces won't get much where. And of course, Iran has been buying Russian military technology, paying for the money for that, but Saudi Arabia has more money, and Israel has more advanced technologies to offer to Russia. So for Russia, it's very important to keep Iran, but at the same time have some distance from it. So when Putin is in Tehran, he'll be speaking friendship to the Iranians, but when very powerful Minister Shoigu is in Tel Aviv, he's speaking friendship with the Israelis. And the king was, of course, Saudi Arabia was, of course, here, and offered to spend a lot of money to invest in Russia and to buy Russian technologies, more money than the Iranians have. So, and Russia is trying to get the best out of all of them.
Mayor, what is your response from the Israeli perspective? Now, the Israeli intelligence minister said last Thursday that Israel is willing to resort to military action to ensure Iran never acquires nuclear weapons. When it comes to Putin's visit to Iran, according to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, the Israeli officials have intriguingly remained silent. What will closer ties between Russia and Iran mean for Israel?
I think the threat made by Israeli intelligence minister, that was more for domestic political purposes. I think Israel's focus right now is on Syria, when it comes to relations with President Putin. It's a kind of the mantra, it seems to be suspect and respect. We are not 100% sure that he's our ally, but we respect him and we have close cooperation with him. I think President Putin also values cooperation with the state of Israel. We have 1 million Russian speakers in this country. When the defense minister of Russia visited Israel, he spoke Russian to the defense minister of the state of Israel because he's also a Russian speaker born in Moldova to a Russian family. We have close coordination when it comes to Syria. And I think what Israel is hoping from the visit, it's possible, we don't know, that President Putin may be carrying a message from Prime Minister Netanyahu. Because he's in a perfect position to play the kind of go-between, mediator between Iran and Israel. And if that's the case, then perhaps President Putin is trying to find a solution whereby Iranian and Israeli interests are met, or something close to it, when it comes to finding a solution in a post-war Syria, because that seems to be where we are heading. On the one hand, the Iranians want to stay in Syria because they've invested blood and money in it. On the other hand, the Israelis say Iran has called for our elimination. We cannot afford to have such a country having bases in Syria. On the one hand, the Iranians want Assad to stay. On the other hand, the state of Israel says, well, Assad is now closer in the camp of Iran than before the war, so we cannot let him stay. I mean, these are just areas that are possible interest to the state of Israel. At the end of the day, it really depends on President Putin and how far he can get.
Well, we have to leave it there. Interesting situation indeed. And many thanks to our guests, Major Danfa, a Middle East analyst from Tel Aviv, Professor Yang Chen from Shanghai International Studies University, and Pavel Felgenhauer, a military analyst in Moscow. And here is my last point. It is obvious that Russia is playing a more active and important role in the Middle East, not only by coming closer to Iran, but also rapidly repairing and reinforcing its ties with Turkey and reinforcing its ties with Israel. As the Syria talks in Astana enter their 7th round, or finished, the momentum generated by these countries is proving to be still strong. Now, with the U.S. vying to maintain a leading role in the region and Israel firmly opposed to greater influence from Iran, at least on the surface, it is foreseeable that more geopolitical games will be played out in the region. Now, for the local people, stability is what they need most and immediately. Whoever can provide that kind of stability will most likely have the upper hand in the near future. That's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Before I go, here's how you can get your stories, your comments and your videos aired on our program. We'll launch a special show on World Poverty Reduction in mid-November, and we need your input. When you hear the word poverty, what comes to your mind? If you have a question to ask, a comment to make, or a story to tell, send them to me via thepoint@cgtn.com or share it on your Facebook or Twitter account using Poverty and Us as hashtag. Remember to tag me at @thepointwithalex. Thanks for watching. You got my point.